Hey y'all, it's Ryan Nicole, and welcome back to Black Ass Art History Presents Y'all Late to the Revolution, Chapter 1 Resistance from the Beginning, the Jamaican Maroons. Disclaimer: the content, images, language that you are about to experience may be offensive and may lead to triggers. Viewer discretion is advised. Black Ass Art History is committed and dedicated to educating its audiences on the diaspora of melanated people with the intent to provide an honest and holistic history of our narratives. We are committed to ensuring our history and stories are not filtered through white supremacist indoctrination, dogma, and pseudoscience. All right, y'all, let's talk about Jamaica and the Maroon colonies. So, originally, Jamaica was a colony under the Spanish crown around 1655. The British were on an expedition just looking to take over some shit, and they land on Jamaica and they begin to expel the Spanish. In the midst of the Spanish fleeing, the enslaved Africans headed to the mountainous regions of the island and joined the indigenous people that had already escaped, beginning the Maroon colonies. Thus, the population would increase of white Europeans would rise to the max of about 12,000 between 1655 to 1661, and a drastic decrease in 1662. So keep in mind, although the British colonized Jamaica, they did not have full control of the island. So this was the typical land structure. They had three land holding types. Estates produced sugar exclusively, plantations did coffee and pimento, and then there were the pens, which is the cattle, oxen, and other animals. And there were two type of owners: the residents that actually lived in Jamaica, and the absentee who lived in Britain but had someone managing their plantation, estate, or pen. So this is an aquatic of Montego Bay, Jamaica. This is by an artist named Hakewell, and it's just a picturesque tour of the island of Jamaica from drawings made in the years of 1820 and 1821. Now, although this is a later image, it was typical for these images to circulate around the Americas and on the old world in Europe to try and get people to come over to the new world. But let's start talking about emancipation. As I mentioned in our previous session, maroon colonies have long existed. So let's take a look at the word's etymology from the European origins. So from Spanish, the word comes from cimarron, which means wild and unruly. And French, the word maroon means feral or fugitive. So enslaved Africans and indigenous persons who escaped slavery would form their own settlements, hence the maroon colonies. They were also known as free towns, and y'all, they existed as long as chattel slavery did. This map is a great representation of a high overview of where some of these maroon colonies were established in North America, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Please keep in mind that in the maroon colonies, would enslaved persons had a wide array of experiences. Some ran immediately after disembarking from the vessels, some escaped due to heavy abuse and labor on the plantation, and some escaped later but were skilled laborers after being on the plantation for some time. Jamaican Maroons were actually the Akan people, and they were known to be fierce warriors and fighters. So on the map, you see the multiple maroon colonies or windward colonies. The highlighted blue is Nanny Town, and is named after an amazing woman named Nanny, who is a legend in her own right, and we're going to learn about. So who is this Queen Nanny? Unfortunately, most of Nanny's history is oral, which makes sense because in the tradition of African culture, our history is oral. Therefore, her dates and times of Jamaica and even her origin stories vary. One origin story is that she was born in Jamaica to a prince of an Ashanti tribe who was captured by the Spaniards circa 1640. Other origin stories says she came as a free woman and may have had her own enslaved persons. We do know for a fact that she is of the Ashanti tribe and she had four brothers. She's also an Obeya or Abeyi, which is a spell casting and healing practice from West African, and continued to practice in the West Indies. And soon maroon towns began to spring up throughout the mountainous region of Jamaica. Each of the maroon leaders would govern a town. So Cujo, another maroon, had leeward maroons, and Quail had windward maroons. Here's the thing, y'all. One of my favorite legends of Nanny is what the British said about her. Nanny would actually observe the British officers shooting rounds. After they departed, she would measure the distance from where they stood and shot to where the bullets landed. So one day, Nanny decided to tease the officers by turning around and showing her bare ass. The officers began to shoot at her, but she remained standing. She had positioned herself far enough so the bullets would not reach her. So the officers became terrified, and the legend and rumor spread that this Obeya could stop bullets with her ass. So let's get into the First Maroon War from 1728 to 1739. So multiple Maroon towns were fighting the British. The British would send reinforcements, and because of the guerrilla tactics employed by Nanny and Quao, the British kept getting defeated. There would be many times that British would attempt to occupy Nanny Town. However, with the collaboration between Nanny, Quao, the Windward Maroons, the Leeward Maroons, Akampong, and Cujo, forced the British into a treaty. This treaty was signed in both 1739 and 1740. So keep in mind they were able to defeat because they had a number of benefits on their side. Communication, they would use via a bang, and a bang is just an animal horn with a hole to communicate through sounds. They knew the terrain of Jamaica, so they knew the swamps and the mountainous regions. Most of the territory they occupied was positioned near rugged land, and there was one way in and one way out. So, although they had all these beautiful tactics to work for them to establish these maroon colonies, um, the British did not make it easy. And what I mean by that, the specific treaty signifies the British would not be able to defeat the Maroons, but it was still in the British favor. The British would allow the Maroon towns to exist and not attack on these conditions. One, slavery still must exist. Two, if an enslaved person becomes a fugitive and runs to the Maroon towns, they have to deny them and send them back to the plantation. Three, any attack on British, including an uprising of the current enslaved persons or population, the Maroon colonies had to fight on the side of the British. Some of the established Maroon towns would even have white British superintendents. So, yeah, not the best. But then the next war or battle is by a brother named Taki, known as Taki's War. Taki was an Akan that led his uprising. He was a chief in Guinea of West Africa. He was a merchant and also a slave trader himself. He was captured and made the overseer of the frontier plantation. His rebellion comprised of multiple tribes from Ghana: Ashanti, Akiem, Nzima, Fanti, etc. So imagine just various groups off the west coast of Africa having different fighting styles, patterns, but still unifying to resist this enslavement. One of the most important rebellions prior to the Haitian Revolution is Taki's War. Honestly, they just wanted to take the island back and create their own black independent country. So you're going to notice a trend when it comes to these rebellions. Taki's War from 1760 to 1761 actually occurred on Easter Monday, April 7th, 1760, early in the morning. They strategically attacked plantations that led to the port where Fort Hadaline, which had all the goods, ammunition, and weapons. As the rebellion progressed, an estimated 400 persons were involved. So they strategically would go and attack each plantation, liberate those folks. They would join and they would just make their way through. On April 9th, 1760, British called upon the Maroons to honor their treaty and fight along the British. So the Maroons were strategic in attacking the Obeyas, or the spiritual leaders like Nanny, because spirituality was important and crucial to the spirit of resistance. As more enslaved persons that followed Taki began to get killed, those enslaved persons returned to the plantation, whilst Taki and others pressed on. The Maroons had a marksman named Devi, and he was able to shoot and kill Taki in full sprint. Taki head unfortunately would be displayed, and the remaining men of Taki's rebellion bodies were found in a cave as they committed suicide versus returning to slavery. Although this lasted not as long, the rebellions would continue and become more frequent. So even though this specific war didn't last that long, Taki's War continued in variations. Thus, we have the Second Maroon War, 1795 to 1796. So the Windward Maroons, specifically Trelawney Town, are not filling this treaty with the British. Unfortunately, two Maroons were found guilty of stealing livestock. Now, we don't know whether that happened or not. And the British had one of the enslaved persons beat them. So let's pause and think about that, because now we're having a further disconnect. You have the Maroons who have their freedom, so to speak. And now any enslaved person that's trying to access their freedom realizes that the Maroons are siding with the British. So if I'm this enslaved person and my British master is telling me to beat these free black people that won't help me, you know there's going to be some pent up frustration. And that's what happened. When the Maroon leaders heard about this, they went to the British officers to air their grievances and they were arrested. The reason that they were arrested is because of a newly installed governor named Alexander Lindsay. Lindsay was an Earl of Scottish descent. Lindsay also believed that they would be inspired by the revolutions occurring in France. This misunderstanding led to an 8-month war. At the onslaught of the Maroon War, this is where the messiness begins to emerge. Remember, the Maroons are obligated to support the British, slavery, and return fugitive enslaved persons. We also know that folks with power can be drunk with it. Cujo, who was his own town, Trelawney Town, the British Windward, who remained neutral during the rebellion, and the Acapone sided with the British. So the Trelawney Town, Cujo's people said, no, we're not fighting this. We're not doing this. Now we against you. So now this is where the war kicked off. Mind you, the Maroons had access to British ammunition, weapons, their military strategy, and tactics on top of guerrilla warfare they have perfected. So what happened was a white superintendent from Acapone sent an officer to Trelawney Maroons to squash this before it got out of hand. The officer was killed by the Maroons and beheaded. Now the other Maroon colony is fighting the Trelawney Maroons. Because of the relentless fighting, General Walpole, who's a British officer, decided to scorch everything. He said, let's just burn their territories so they can't get access to what they need. The Trelawney agreed to surrender so as long as they would not be deported. Remember, Walpole, being a man of his word, said that's fine, we'll get a treaty. The treaty required the Trelawney Maroons to beg for forgiveness to the king on their knees and return any runaway enslaved persons and relocate. The governor ratified it and said they had 3 days. There wasn't a specific time, but the governor ratified it, said 3 days from January 1st of 1796 to do the forgiveness piece. Most of the Maroon colonies waited till March. The governor had them deported to Nova Scotia. Yes, there was some territory up in Nova Scotia at that time that did have enslaved people. General Walpole was so infuriated and went to the governor and said, I gave these men my word. The governor disregarded him, and England supported the governor's decision. So Walpole just left. So after Tacky War, rebellions continued to occur, but not to large scales. Keep in mind, between 1760 and 1830s, British had lost the Revolutionary War with the American colonies. They had the War of 1812, in addition to uprising in territories and colonies. Rumors of rebellions across the islands and West Indies made its way to Jamaica. The Maroons continued to support the British with the fugitive slaves. Next, we have Samuel Daddy Sharp. He was an enslaved person by an English attorney. He was baptized, and he actually became a deacon at the Virtual Baptist Church. Enslaved persons were allowed to hold religious gatherings. Meanwhile, across the pond, British Parliament began having discussions about abolishing slavery in all British colonies and territories. The planners and the estate owners were irritated and frustrated with the thought of the idea. However, it would be through these rumblings that would lead to one of the largest uprisings in the British colonies. So, Daddy Sharp led the Baptist War after church. He would have these conversations for the uprisings. Planned for the revolt to happen on Christmas Day, and the following day was Boxing Day. He presumed that they would just continue to have those days off. So on Christmas, the enslaved person protested for more free time and even wages because of the labor. When they were not addressed, on December 27, 1831, the rebellion went into a full launch. This uprising was extremely organized, strategically attacking the sugarcane plantations by setting it on fire. That was also a militarized group called the Black Regiment, whose training allowed them to fight the various militias. So not only did they have the enslaved, but they even had the Black Regiment, who was trained, now fighting alongside them. Now, remember, the British didn't control all of Jamaica, so word had spread, and another military regiment of Black enslaved persons began fighting on the other side of the island. So now they're taking it from different points of the island and closing in. Although the rebellion ended the first week of 1832, sporadic rebellions throughout the island continued. Eventually, on August 1st, 1834, the British freed roughly 750,000. It might be 70, yeah, the remainder, around 75,000, of enslaved persons in the West Indies. So, just a quick recap. Enslaved Africans fought the British and were able to establish Maroon or Windward colonies. Unfortunately, once they were established, they were still confined to British rules. The obeahs and guerrilla warfare were key tactics to fighting the British. The Second Maroon War was an indicator that the Maroons did not support British rule. Ongoing battles and wars such as the Revolutionary War and War of 1812 impacted the British colonies in the West Indies drastically. Lastly, Britain would eventually free enslaved persons in 1834. So thank you all guys for listening. I hope you all enjoy and stay tuned as tomorrow we learn about the Great Haiti and its revolution.